After falling head over heels for Joe Smith for 3 years, I finally got the proposal I had been waiting for. However, on the day of our wedding, he did not show up until the wee hours of the morning. When I found him, Joe was drinking happily with a young girl in his arms. I'm already tired of her clinginess. She's a joke. Who else would want her? Much later, he made me a wedding ring and proposed with my favorite jasmine flowers. But a muscular man opened the door instead. The man had 2 scratch marks on his neck and smirked at the disheveled Joe. Isn't it a bit too shameless of you to propose to a married woman? Most of the attendees at my wedding, who witnessed the spectacle, had left. I was the only one left stunned and in disbelief. My parents consoled me with teary eyes. Veronica, it's all our fault. We shouldn't have rushed you into marriage. Who would have thought, my fiancé, Joe Smith, had fled from our wedding? The man who had kissed my forehead tenderly just the night before had vanished without a trace. I bawled my eyes out in the vanity room until my makeup was completely ruined. I felt incredibly hurt when I looked at the ring on my finger. I had a crush on Joe for 3 years, and my feelings for him had been evident. He enjoyed the luxury of having home-cooked lunches at work and hangover remedies after drinking out all night. I would always be there for him, come rain or shine. A week ago, Joe got drunk again. He was drowsy as he leaned against me in the back seat of the car. I tried my best to provide him a shoulder to lean on, and my heart swelled with joy from being so close to him. Right then, he asked, Veronica, do you really like me? I froze and nodded, but I realized that his eyes were shut. So, I quickly replied, yes. Joe propped himself up and leaned closer. He looked incredibly handsome. Then, he smiled and kissed the corner of my lips before he said in a low voice, marry me, then. It felt like the happiest moment of my life. I was so overwhelmed with joy that my ears began to ring. The next day, Joe asked his assistant to send me a ring that I thought was a bit large for my finger. Nevertheless, I treasured it deeply. After the spectacle, I scrolled through his social media and managed to find him in person at a bar. He was hugging another girl, and my dreams shattered instantly. Now that you've left her at the altar, what's going to happen to her? Joe enjoyed himself as the girl kissed him on the cheeks. He laughed heartily and said, I'm already tired of her clinginess. Besides, what can she do even if she gets mad? Everyone knows that she's head over heels for me. Who would want her? I was standing at the private room's door, and I felt a rush of disappointment wash over me. Falling in love with Joe had been easy. He was a senior of mine. Being handsome and kind, he checked all the boxes for what I had envisioned in my future partner. However, I soon realized that there was a stark difference between us. We once went on a picnic, and he had invited his friends, who were all wealthy heirs and heiresses. During our excursion, they traveled in several recreational vehicles and even organized the picnic at one of their family estates. Looking at their lavish lifestyle, I felt embarrassed and hid my tiny picnic basket behind me. Joe noticed and graciously took the picnic basket from me. He complimented the simple sandwiches I had made. As the sun shone through the leaves, it lit up his face and gentle smile. I felt myself blushing and feeling lightheaded at that moment. He had given me plenty of cold shoulders and put me through a lot over the past 3 years. But such acts of kindness would make me forgive him for everything. It started pouring, and I did not bring an umbrella when I rushed to the bar. I had no choice but to stand at the entrance and get a ride through an app. Just then, a car stopped right next to me. I frowned as I glanced at the number plate, but I only managed to make out 2 identical numbers in the rain. I quickly hopped into the car to escape the downpour. Thank you, sir. When I looked up, I saw a familiar face. It was my childhood neighbor, Jason Evans. He handed me a towel as he gazed at me calmly and said, I was rushing back for your wedding dinner. How did you end up in such a mess? I let out a sigh and slowly dried my hair. I got dumped. But aren't you working with crocodiles abroad? Why are you back driving for e-hailing services? Jason froze briefly and burst into laughter. I bet that's not what your mom said. Perhaps she meant I studied finance abroad? He did not dwell on the subject any further. Let's go. I'll take you home. Don't worry about that man. You deserve better. I forced myself to keep the conversation going. Yes. Like who? Jason soon sent me to the house I had bought, and he stared happily at my shocked face. Like someone who sells crocodiles, the next day, Joe transferred $500,000 to my account. This amount was nothing to him. I treated it as compensation for leaving me and gladly accepted it. I still felt a little upset, but I was the type who could quickly bounce back on my feet. So, I no longer yearned for what I could not have. I was an illustrator, and I had allowed a lot of work to pile up in preparation for my wedding. It was time to get back on track. When I arrived at the office to discuss custom illustrations with the editor, I ran into someone I did not want to meet. It was the girl who had kissed Joe. She clearly recognized me. Since we were the only 2 in the elevator, she suddenly burst out laughing. It's ridiculous that you came all the way here. You're absurd. I stared at her in confusion and saw her smirking. It doesn't really matter even if you know Joe is here. For your information, he's arranged for me to be here to support my career, so get a grip. I shot her a glance and stared ahead. I work here, so don't worry about me. Do you actually think you're the main character? It's ridiculous. It looks like being Joe's mistress doesn't give you many advantages either. I thought you'd be my boss by now. That would have been more impressive. Don't make me feel embarrassed for you. I had always been sharp-tongued, but I had held back because Joe was not fond of it. However, there was no reason to let a stranger berate me out of nowhere. She trembled in anger and glared at me as she walked out of the elevator. Unfortunately, she was right. When I arrived at the editor-in-chief's office, Joe was sitting inside and staring at me calmly. "Veronica, this job doesn't suit you. It's too challenging. If you want to keep working, you can be my personal secretary. You'll earn much more than you do now." With that, Joe sealed my fate and casually handed my opportunity to the lady who had just entered. My voice trembled as I struggled to suppress my anger. "Joe Smith, are you insane? You have no right to decide what I do." He frowned and replied, "I'm your fiancé, so what's wrong? Are you still mad about what happened that day?" He walked over and tried to take my hand. "Why bother with all these formalities when you'll end up marrying me either way?" I took a step back and glared at him. "We've broken up, and the engagement has been called off. Don't touch me. You disgust me."